I'm Matt Laurie. I'm going to be the MC for the day. It's going to be the morning. It's going to be a very interesting session. You're going to hear some interesting things from some interesting people, experts in their fields, both nationally, internationally as well, and locally. We're going to kick off with a prayer, and I'd like to ask Andy Joseph to do the honours.
Thank you, Pancho. Ata Maria kia tātou katoa. Ata Maria is the nice way of saying good morning. Try it. Ata Maria. Remember that. Ka pai. It sounded beautiful. Tuatahi ka mihi atu kia koutou, no mai te tēnei hui hui. Welcome to this word, this special occasion. Child Poverty Action Group. Tuatahi ka mihi atu kia koe, Rachel, no mai. Richard, our council members, distinguished guests, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou. No mai, of course, is welcome. Piki mai means to climb on board, and it's lovely that we've all climbed on board this waka of Poverty for Action Group. Ne? Nō reira, ka inoi tātou. I want to share a prayer for our country, and need I just remind you of how wonderful and how lucky and how precious it is that we live in New Zealand. And so, hear my prayer. E te atu ka harawa, tēnei te ino atu ki a koe mō ngā manaakitanga katoa. Uhi o mai ngā manaakitanga ki runga hi a mātou. Whakawātea mai ngā ahuatanga, ahu pū hai hai, ngā ngautuara e rā mea katoa. Kia tau ei ko te rangi Māria e ngā maunga runga. And those words are saying loud and clear, God of the southern seas, of these islands, of Maori and Pākehā, and of all who dwell in our land, we give you thanks and praise for what we have achieved together. Increase our trust in one another. Strengthen our quest for justice, and bring us to unity and a common purpose. Blessed are you, God of the planet Earth. You have set our world like a radiant jewel in the heavens, filled it with action, beauty, suffering, struggle, and hope. Blessed are you, God of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and all the peoples who live here, and all the lessons we have learned, and all that remains for us to do. Blessed are you because you need us, because you make us worthwhile, and because you give us people to love and work to do, for your universe and for your world and for ourselves. Hei mua koe ia mātou e hoa, hei tohu tohu ia mātou mahi katoa. Ko koe anaka hei whakakaha ia mātou, kia whai kororia i koe ia mātou mahi katoa. He mea tīmata, he mea mahi, he mea whakaoti i roto i āpū. And those words are saying loud and clear. Go before us, Lord. Guide us, we pray, in all that we do. You alone gives us strength, that our deeds may glorify you. We begin labour and accomplish through you alone, that by your grace we may receive eternal life. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. Might I just add these few words? Kia kaha, kia manawa nui, Kowe, mamai. Yeah. In other words, be strong, be vigilant, and kia kaha. And my blessing for each of you today. Mata Maria te atu e korone e taia te whakaaro a meo koutou ngāta. Kia kaha kia u, ki a koutou. I runga te ingoa te matua, te tama me te wairua tapu. Ake. Kia ora tātou.
Kia ora, Andy. Andy has a great gift for making me feel really good inside. Just gets up and talks and everything sort of chills out. So again, welcome to this morning's session. The Post-Budget Breakfast Series is an initiative of the Child Poverty Action Group, which is represented today by Professors Susan St John and Innes Asher, who join us from Auckland. Also joining us is documentary filmmaker and author Brian Bruce. The Child Poverty Action Group is an independent charity working to eliminate child poverty in New Zealand through research, education and advocacy. In a country like New Zealand, with ample resources, child poverty should be completely eliminated. It's all about choice. Everyone agrees children need the right conditions to grow into healthy adults. Children thrive when they have the basics: nutritious food, a warm, safe home, medical attention if they're sick, and a good education. Sadly, too many children in New Zealand don't have the basics. CPAG, which is the short way of saying the Child Poverty Action Group, CPAG speaks out on behalf of the estimated 260,000 children in New Zealand whose meagre standard of living compromises their health, education and well-being. CPAG also works to protect children from needless poverty, because a child's potential is a terrible thing to waste. This is the first Child Poverty Action Group post-budget breakfast to be held in Nelson, Tasman, which is pretty choice. The objectives of today's event are to provide an opportunity to learn more about the 2016 budget and how it affects children, and to learn more about the local poverty-related issues and also the initiatives that are trying to alleviate that poverty. This is possible due to some excellent local speakers. We have Nelson Mayor Rachel Rees, Tasman Mayor Richard Kempthorne, Pete Mitchener, the Principal of Stoke School, Carrie Mazzina, the Director of the Nelson Tasman Housing Trust, and Dr Rob Beaglehole, the Chief Dental Officer from the Nelson Marlborough District Health Board. It's also nice to be able to acknowledge my fellow Nelson City Councillors Brian McGurk and Pete Rainey. So the way it's going to work is we're going to hear from Brian first, then you'll have the opportunity to ask some questions. We'll then be we'll be hearing from Susan St John and Innes Asher.
We are here because too many New Zealanders think, why should I look after other people's children? They're not my problem. These are often the people who resent paying taxes, particularly paying taxes to look after children whose parents are on the benefit. They think that tax is theft. They don't think it's the way that we have civilization. These are the people who don't buy into the fairness argument, that we're all better off, even the rich, if we live in a fair society. If you're rich and you live in a fair society, you'll live longer. Your children will probably not have less chance of being on drugs or get pregnant or whatever, teenage pregnancies. All of those things will be better, even for rich people, in a fair society. And these are people who also don't buy into the moral goodness argument that you should just do it because it's a good thing. So when I'm talking to people who, those kind of me-centered people, and I try to convince them why we should look after other people's children, I appeal to their selfishness. You know, the reason that we look after our children and we look after other people's children is that they will look after us when we get sick and old. Oh, that's a good reason. And the other thing I say to me-centered New Zealanders who want to, who are also the kind of people who want to blame parents, bad parenting, who want to say that there are, we've only got this problem because parents make poor life choices, which tends to lead to poor circumstances for their children. And that if these bad parents didn't drink or smoke or gamble, they'd have money for their kids. What I say to them is, no. You've got the wrong end of the stick here. It's the children's fault that they're poor, because they weren't smart enough to pick rich parents with no addictions when they were born. And they look at me as if I'm crazy and they say, but hey, you know, kids can't choose their parents. And I say, exactly. And by that I don't mean to infer, from what I just said, that parents who are struggling financially are bad parents. I don't mean that at all, that's rubbish. What's bad are government budgets that continue to benefit the few of us at the expense of the many. What's bad are budgets that continue to deny families the right to a warm, dry, affordable place to live. What's bad are budgets that punish children in our poorest homes by punishing their parents for being out of work. Now, if these sound like moral issues to you, rather than economic ones, that's because in the end, all economic decisions are moral decisions. If you aim to deliver tax cuts next year, which is what this budget aims to do, instead of extending parental leave or feeding healthy meals to kids at school, that's a moral decision. If you decide to spend $178 million so our government can spy on its citizens, and only $100 million to clean up polluted rivers and lakes, that also is a moral decision. Excuse me. Should have wet my finger ahead of this. You won't find the words child poverty in this year's budget, or in the Minister of Finance's speech. In fact, it took a very long time for our government to recognise there is such a thing as child poverty. When my documentary, Inside Child Poverty, was released in 2011, in the week of the election, the reaction of the national-led government at the time was denial. There's no such thing as child poverty. He's got his facts wrong. He's a leftist socialist journo and he's just making it up. Certainly if you listen to the likes of Sean Plunkett or Mike Hoskins on the radio, you would have heard that view expressed along with their total disbelief that I could have been funded by taxpayer money to make such a program. Weeks later, when National was re-elected, Social Welfare Minister Paula Bennett said that she still doubted there was such a thing as child poverty, and even if there was, you couldn't measure it. Well, GPs in low socio-economic areas like East Porirua had a way of measuring child poverty. It was in the large numbers of children turning up at their surgeries with poverty-related diseases and infections. And I wonder if you could play video one, please. This is not my video. Sorry?
Just gotta wait for it to load.
Gotta wait for it to load. Shall I carry on?
Yes.
What you would have seen was a GP in Porirua talking about all of the diseases and infections and illnesses that children suffer because of the quality of the bad quality of the housing they live in. You know, skin infections because of overcrowding, rheumatic fever, where kids have to have injections in the bum for for years. That's right. I think the count was 120 injections, I think, over 10 years. When I asked this particular GP if there was one thing that he could fix, that if he was given the power to fix it, what would he do to change all of the terrible things that were coming into his he was seeing in his surgery? And the answer was fix the houses. Warm, dry, houses, put insulation in, do all of that. So the reality is we know what we have to do. We could fix a lot of problems that Professor Asher will be talking about simply by fixing the houses. But we're not doing that. That's the big gap in this budget. We know what to do because in 2012 the Commissioner for Children, Dr. Russell Wills, challenged the idea that you can't measure child poverty by organising a group of public health experts and other notable academics, led by Professor Jonathan Boston, who produced a report entitled Solutions to Child Poverty in New Zealand, Evidence for Action. They came up with, I believe, 78 different separate recommendations, of which I think about 23 have either been partially or wholly implemented. And in 2013, a Health Select Committee report for improving child wellbeing listed 130 detailed recommendations for improving the health of our children. Unfortunately, I can't find an update on that report, so I can't tell you which of those recommendations were implemented and which weren't. What I can tell you is that by the beginning of his third term in government, Prime Minister John Key had brought himself not only to say the words child poverty, but that we should make it a priority, which makes it even more surprising that you don't find those words in the budget. However, we have made some progress. Child poverty is no longer a figment of my imagination, so I can stop taking the pills. And thanks to the work of a lot of people like Child Poverty Action Group, the Children's Commissioner, UNICEF and Tick for Kids campaign, child poverty became an election issue, and we have seen some improvements. For example, back in 2011, when I made the documentary, there was no free medical care for children. Today, we've got free medical care for children under 13, because the idea has finally filtered through to the government that prevention is more cost effective than hospital care. But as I'm sure that Professor Asher will tell you, there's still an awful lot of children suffering totally preventable diseases because we still really have not addressed our biggest problem, which is warm, dry, affordable housing for everyone. Are we able to play video too? Or is that too difficult?
Maybe. Your laptop's just coming away near.
Oh, okay, I'll carry on. We still don't have, for example, warrant of fitnesses for housing. You can't drive your car if it's going to kill other people, if it's going to fail, and if it's going to, put people's lives in danger. We shouldn't be able to rent a house that does the same, seems to me. And we don't have full-on warrant of fitnesses for housing because property ownership is the favourite form of investment for New Zealanders. And if we demanded that landlords make their rental properties healthy to live in, then investors will complain that they're losing money. And if you further impose a capital gains tax, you'll lose votes from the centre. That's why you don't see bold steps getting taken in this budget to solve the problem of affordable housing. Those of you who have seen my work will know that what I want is a fairer distribution of wealth in New Zealand. Last week, TV3 played my documentary on education, as you heard, part of which dealt with the fact that our public education system is neither free nor fair. We're a small country. We can't afford to waste one single brain. We know that intelligence is a normally distributed curve. It's a Bell diagram. So, rich or poor, intelligence is distributed right throughout the community in a bell shape. But if a student goes to a decile 1 to 3 school, in our country, they have a 62% chance of passing NCA Level 2, the old university entrance. If they attend a decile 9 or 10 school, they've got a 92% chance of passing NCA Level 2. That's a 30% difference in what educators call equity or fairness. That's not to malign low decile schools. In the documentary, I celebrated some absolutely fantastic teaching that I saw in a decile 1 school. What that 30% is a measure of is the effect of poverty on educational outcome. And whichever way you try to spin it, when you have that kind of gap between rich and poor schools in a public education system, it's time not just to look at the hardware of education, the new schools and classrooms, but the software. We need to make life better for our children outside the school gate. And we need to reduce administrative demands on our teachers so that they're freed up to do what we pay them to do, teach. And we need to have a nationwide conversation about that. Because how we teach our children today will determine the future, our economic future, our personal futures tomorrow. So as you consider this year's budget or any other future budget, I want you to remember that all economic decisions are moral decisions. Now I invite you to look beyond the figures to ask whether the way the wealth of our country is being distributed will benefit the many or the few, and what's in it for our poorest children.
Thank you very much, Brian. I always, when I'm having that conversation with people about selfishness, I don't try to appeal to their selfishness. I rebrand it and call it enlightened self-interest. People kind of like that one. Thank you very much, Brian. I gave you a bit of a bum steer at the start. We're going to have the Q&A session after our next two speakers. I should have also reminded you that if your phone's on, can you turn it on to silent? And if we have any kind of emergency, there's obviously one exit there, there's one exit there, and the loos are at the front of the building. Okay, so next we go to one of our other visitors from Auckland. Are you presenting together or one after the other? One after the other, okay. So I'd like to welcome Professor Susan St. John, first of all, is that right? Who is CPAG's economics spokesperson. Please give a warm welcome to Susan.
So we're delighted. This is actually the 7th or 8th post-budget event that CPAG has been involved with up and down New Zealand. And it is actually our 16th budget breakfast year. And every year it's been growing. In Auckland, we're going to have to find a bigger venue for next year. Now that tells you something. There's something very wrong. When we look at this budget, it's a band-aid budget. And many commentators have chewed this over already. We're a week on from the budget. And I'm going to be talking about a little bit about the economy and about incomes. But of course, there's been endless analysis out there, so we're not going to labour that this morning. I come from Auckland. I am sick of living in a city that has changed so drastically. When I walk down Queen Street in Auckland, I fall over the homeless, people living under the benches, people begging. A really changed city. Here are some images from Auckland. Slum houses selling for $1 million. The homeless lying on the side of the street. And then the top, what's happening in South Auckland, where people are living in cars, where people just do not have any hope for the future, where 700 families can attend an event put on by the Auckland Action Against Child Poverty to try to help those families find out what they're actually entitled to. And those families were queuing from 6 o'clock in the morning at the event that was held. This is not the kind of country that I want to live in. Now, I'm an economist, and I do have to talk a little bit about the economics. Economists, unfortunately, for too long have been silent about distributional aspects of the budget. We tend to want to talk in generalities, look at averages, what's happening overall to averages, and use seriously flawed measures like GDP to give indications of success. Now, this graphic just shows, that bottom line shows, our current recovery from the recession that started 2008, global financial crisis. And our recovery compared to other post-war recessions shown in that grey line, dotted line, and the grey area there giving the range, is what's happened in the recovery from other recessions. This is a slow recovery, and it's not one to be as excited about as the government would like us to be. So when we look at the figures of the projections of what's going to happen, and we look at what's happening to GDP, the government's making a great deal of the fact that we've got positive growth in GDP, and it talks about the 3%, the 2.6, the 2.9% compared to other countries. We're doing really, really well. Well, this is a huge degree of generality. And of course what they're not factoring in there is the fact that we have very rapid population growth. So this comes from the CTU, who have looked at GDP per person. And when you do that, going out, the growth is very unspectacular indeed. So we have a slow recovery. We have a really poor situation as we go out. And of course, underlying these figures is the distribution of whatever growth there is. And the distribution is becoming ever more adverse. Unemployment, as you can see, is predicted to remain at very high levels. And wage growth is fairly flat. So what we're seeing is the share of the economy which is going to the wages is falling. Now, this is not a prospect for a happy, successful future for New Zealand. One more budget numbers table, which might look a bit daunting, but I want you just to look at the second row, the Obergel, which is the horrible economics term for government surplus. Now, the government, as you know, has been running deficits following the Christchurch earthquake and borrowing. But in recent times, it's starting to produce these surpluses, which of course it's getting very excited about. Now, the surplus is used in part to do things like lend to students and capital expenditure, but what is predicted as we go out is that the surpluses increasingly are going to leave over a cash surplus. And the government is saying it can do one of two things with that cash surplus. The first thing is repay debt, and it's got an obsession about debt. Now, again, this is from the CPU. I want you just to look at the bottom line, net debt, including the New Zealand Super Fund. What the government does is it concentrates on net debt, excluding the government super fund, and so it's talking about getting net debt down to 20%. That's already absurdly low for a country like New Zealand. But when you take the New Zealand super fund assets into account, as myself and many economists believe that you should, CPU, putting up this diagram, you can see we actually get down to net debt almost invisible levels. What is not the problem is government debt. It is private debt that has been increased because of the squeeze that has come on the budget year after year, forcing people in the private sector, households, to go further and further into debt. So the concentration on net debt is not appropriate. But the government is also saying, as has been said already, that the government has got its eye on being able to offer tax cuts as a bribe next year. Now, when we look at the deficit in the social sectors, in the social infrastructure spending, in housing, education, health, this is not an appropriate way to go. But my bigger question today is to ask who has sacrificed the generation of that surplus? Who has actually paid for that surplus? Here we've got a graphic showing the total spend on social assistance. So my focus as an economist for Child Poverty Action Group is to look at what's happening to incomes and in particular our policies on income redistribution. So here we've got our spending on money that goes as redistribution. And you can see visually the blue bit there, domination of New Zealand super. Then we've got welfare benefits, the orange bit, and we've got working for families, which is the bit for children. So welfare benefits you can think of as for the working age population, along with the bits and pieces we spend on rent and accommodation supplement and so on. So what is going to be happening over time is that New Zealand super is going to be growing, so that whole pie will grow, but actual spending on the working age population and on families is not going to. So what happens is New Zealand super takes an ever increasing share of that spend, and it's going to go up from 39 to 55% between 2010 and 2020. Now, let's just unpick that a little bit further. Here we've got the actual amount spent on New Zealand super from 2010 going out to the 2020. You can see the consistent march upwards in the amount that we are spending there, going from just over 8 billion up to 15 billion at the end of this period. Billion. So we're talking about a huge amount of money going in here. There are two major reasons why we're getting this. One we've got to accept, which is the fact that we have an ageing population and we've simply got more people. The other reason is that the government is spending extra in real terms per person on superannuation every year. It doesn't have to actually front up and admit that in the budget because it's automatic. New Zealand super is designed so that every year it is adjusted for wage growth. And we can see that here where we have the weekly amount from 2006 going up to 2016 of, first of all, the top line is New Zealand super, the rate for living alone. The second line is what happens to the sole parent benefit, with a little bit of a kick up because of that $25 that the government had found for last budget. And the bottom line is what happens to the unemployment benefit, job seeker benefit, which you can see is considerably lower what somebody on superannuation gets. And the reason those lines are diverging is that benefit, sole parent benefit and the job seeker benefit are tied only to prices. And so this year there was a zero increase because inflation's been so low, but superannuation continued to go up and the single rate of New Zealand super went up $10 a week. But the government doesn't have to explain that in the budget because it's automatic for New Zealand super. Now that's not to say it's a bad thing. I think it's a great thing. I'm a great supporter of New Zealand superannuation. I think it's good because we've done well. We don't have the poverty problem amongst older generation because we keep them up with living standards by a link to wages. Very, very important. But what we're not seeing is how badly we're doing for others of working age who are on benefits. And what we have found as well, and we're particularly interested in this in Child Poverty Action Group, is that the redistributive program for children working for families has not been protected. It has not been protected the way that New Zealand Super has been protected. Now, I'll just briefly take you through working for families. If we start from the beginning, 2001, we didn't have working for families. We had a family assistance program which had been neglected. It was really performing badly. It was responsible for a lot of child poverty being so miserable, and something had to be done. So 2005 to 2007, we got working for families. We needed to have that boost. It was greatly important, and it was very successful in bringing down the overall child poverty rate. From that point on, from the end of 2008 onwards, we have inflation adjustment for working for families. Didn't work terribly well, but you could see that if that went on, we'd be following that second to last red arrow out into the future. Instead, what happened in the 2011 budget is that the government introduced some changes to working for families, which I'm sure hardly anyone understands. They're very subtle, but they're a combination of things that reduce working for families for those of in working families over time. So going out, we are going to see a squeeze on working for families. So just to unpick that a little bit further, here we've got a graphic from our budget analysis this year showing the real spending on working for families 2010 going out for 2020. And the real spend should be constant. It should be more than constant, it should actually be going up. But if it were protecting working for families, we would see the same level going out. Instead, we are going to see this really significant decline in the spend. So if we look at the figures for this budget and say, well, how much would the government be spending on working for families had it been adjusted for inflation, it would be spending an extra 700 million. So there you've got one of the reasons why the government is able to generate these surpluses. It's squeezing working for families. That's not the only thing that's wrong with working for families. Now, I could spend 5 hours telling you about working for families. It's the most complex, difficult, convoluted, rotten program that one could ever devise. But let's, for the purposes today, because time is short, think of working for families as two parts: the family tax credit, which is a per child per week payment going to the caregiver, and the in-work tax credit. Those are the major two parts of it. The in-work tax credit is for children, it goes to the caregiver, she gets it. She doesn't necessarily know that part of what she's getting is in-work tax credit and part is family tax credit. She just gets it. And the other little bits at the top are really nasty little things that we haven't got time to talk about today. Now, that bit, the in-work tax credit, that bit there, is the bit that the government has separated off and denied to 230,000 of New Zealand's poorest children because their parents are non-deserving, they don't meet adequate work criteria. That red bit is the bit that the government increased in the last budget. So when we look at the size of the in-work tax credit and see what that means to the families that miss out, here we've got a graphic showing $72.50 worth of food per week that families that miss out, often for extremely arbitrary reasons, maybe they've lost work, maybe they've been made redundant, maybe there's an earthquake and suddenly they don't qualify, that is what they're missing out on per week. So, is this a budget for child poverty? I would say it's a budget for more child poverty. And just to finish, there's a brochure at the back about our campaign on fixing working for families. The first part of this campaign is to say you must give all of the assistance that's designed to alleviate child poverty to all families that need it. Don't separate off that $72.50. And the other part of the campaign is to address that erosion that you saw and what's happening to working for families, and the rest of the campaign is to deal with the other nasty little bits. We are really wanting support for this. Thank you.
There's not a lot in this budget for poor people. They're not going to get better housing and the amount of housing that we need. They're going to see a gradual drop off in the kind of benefits that help poor families. And for working for families, they've done no effort at all here to make sure that children who are in homes where parents, for whatever reason, are not in work, are not being discriminated against. You get less money from the government if you're really poor.
Why do you think that is?
Shall I give you the history of neoliberalism? Which is the idea that if the rich are pandered to, then we'll all be better off. It isn't working. What we've got is an enormous gap between the rich and the poor in our country now, and it's time that we revisited this whole economic nonsense that we've been living through for the last 30 years.
And how has this budget compared to previous budgets in regards to child poverty?
Well, it's done absolutely nothing for child poverty, and we're just seeing a continuous decline in the spending on transfers. Of course, the government in the last year's budget did increase benefits, and it did increase part of working for families, and it's resting on its laurels now, assuming that that's going to be enough. So there's no indication we're going to see any attention to family incomes in the future budgets.
If I can just add that when John Key, in his first week in Parliament of this current term, said he was going to make child poverty a focus for this term's government, I find it extraordinary that the words either child poverty or poverty do not occur in the budget or any speech given by the Minister of Finance.